Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very, very warm welcome to the latest Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, it's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, I'm here to talk, title gives it away, of the stories of film. And I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, marketing stories, behind-the-scenes stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films that I tend to choose for this podcast, well, they're more of a mainstream leaning than anything. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. I just celebrate the fact that it's really hard to make a film. I just want to applaud those who've managed to do it. Every now and then as well, I revisit a film that I did in my very, very early days of the podcast. If I happen to have found a huge ton of more information out about it, that's certainly the case with one of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode. And I am going to kick off with that one, a real favourite of mine. I'm going to play you a clip and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
They started the trace.
Where's this, please?
It's my dime. I'll ask the questions. Who are you?
Well, let's say my name is Mr. Abbott.
True.
They made the second leg.
Mr. Abbott, are you interested in C-Tech astronomy?
I'm interested in all kinds of astronomy.
Cute.
They've got the satellite in Tokyo. These guys are good.
I need to know if you're someone who can make a deal.
Go on.
Can you deal?
Yes.
True. They're across Transcom. You've got about 20 seconds, Bish.
If I come in with what I know, can you guarantee my safety?
Do you have the item?
No.
15 seconds.
Can you guarantee my safety?
Where is the item?
Can you guarantee my safety?
5 seconds.
Yes, I can guarantee your safety.
Bish, he's lying!
Hang up. They've almost got us.
He's lying!
Hang up, Bish.
He's lying! He's lying!
Hang up.
I absolutely love this film. This is 1992 Sneakers, directed by Phil Alden Robinson, written by Phil Alden Robinson, Lawrence Lasker and Walter F. Parks, starring Robert Redford, Dan Aykroyd, Ben Kingsley, Mary McDonnell, River Phoenix, Sidney Poitier, David Strathairn. What a cast for this particular movie. And the story for it goes back nearly a decade before we actually got to see it, because it started with Walter F. Parks and Lawrence Lasker, who were doing research for a film they were writing at the time called War Games, which I covered again a long time ago on this podcast. And while they were penning War Games, they did no shortage of research, as they were about to do for Sneakers, which I'm coming to. And they came across the idea of a gang of people called Sneakers, who were looking to expose technological security weaknesses and were hired by firms to try and break defect, that kind of thing. And when they happened across that idea, they just thought there was something in it. Now, at this stage in his career, Phil Alden Robinson was separate to them. He was off doing some work with 20th Century Fox, and Parks and Lasker were trying to get this idea going, and it was Fox's idea that Robinson went and met them. The three of them came together to try and work the film out, and it would be a partnership that would last pretty much the next decade and beyond. So gradually the idea came about of a high-tech Dirty Dozen, as it were. The idea of this ensemble of characters who are carrying out sneaks on behalf of people. But again, the plot went through an awful lot of changes in the time that they were putting this together, because what the trio went to do was they interviewed security experts, computer security experts, they interviewed hackers, they interviewed spies, and just the process of interviewing these people went on while they were doing other work. And so there was not a word written of the screenplay of Sneakers for an awful long time. There were various possible story ideas that they were just fishing around with at that point. So at one stage, the film was going to be a ransom story, that the idea of someone who came up with a technological box, which would make it into the final movie, where someone could use it to hack computers and do anything. They could steal money, they could crash planes, they could try and blackmail the government. So bits of that got in, as you'll know if you're familiar with the film. But then another variant of the story involved a laser defense system and a defense contractor who tried to sell it to the US Department of Defense, who said they would only buy it if the Russians had it first. And so they came up with some kind of plot, and a very complex plot, whereby the sneakers would be hired as part of a thing whereby it looked like this defense system was being sold to the Russians, and thus the American government would want to buy it for a huge amount of money. And the trio of writers got deep into this before they realised actually there was something a lot simpler here, that because they had a version of that would have seen messages hidden in television transmissions and stuff like that. And they just thought, well, no, we just need to take this back a little bit. Now, Phil Alden Robinson then got a job working on a Carl Reiner movie. Director Carl Reiner was making All of Me, a wonderful comedy that is, with Steve Martin and Lily Tomlin. And so he was off writing that. And so by this stage, they'd done a couple of years research on sneakers. Not a word of the screenplay had been written. And so while he went to do that, Lasker and Parks suggested that they start actually writing the screenplay to Sneakers. And then once Robinson was done on his other project, he would come back and then they compare, they just assess how it had gone, which is what happened. That while All of Me was being made and Robinson's commitment to All of Me was being fulfilled, Parks and Lasker wrote 2/3 of the script of Sneakers. But the script that they wrote, again, was quite different, not least in structure, from what we ultimately got. Because they come up with a sequence for the second of the third acts of the film that took place at a toy company called Playtronics. But when Phil Alden Robinson saw that, he suggested that actually was the ending of the movie, because Parks and Lasker felt that they didn't have a finale. Robinson's argument was, you do, but it's right at the moment in the middle of the movie. You've got a really good sneak, but that should be what it's building up to. Once that was moved to the end of the film, Robinson then came in and did lots of changes to the first act of the film just to be able to set the rest of it up. But I'm like spitting out sentences here that are taking me 10, 15 seconds to say at a time, faster if I had coffee. However, the writing of this was taking years. This was still 4 or 5 years of writing that was going on, just as they continue to evolve the film, as they continue to try and get it going. And it was 3 writers who also had to agree. They were doing an awful lot more research. They followed dead ends. They came together in the UCLA Research Library, and they would just go off and look at books other than the ones that they were supposed to be looking at to see what else they could find. But the point where they realised that this was not just a project to write now, this was going to head towards being a film, was when they got a new second act of the film set up. Because then there was something to it. Because by the time the second act was in place, the new second act, the characters felt right. They'd originally written into the film a sequence where the sneakers are recruited for the first time. At one point, they had a boss that they were working for as well. But they realised they didn't need that scene. They could come into this halfway through a sneak, and we could join the team in progress. But because they'd done the work writing how they were all recruited, the 3 writers knew really who these characters were, what they could do with them. However, there were 30 to 40 drafts of the script that had been done by this point, and in a series of really excellent interviews done for Slate magazine a few years ago, Phil Alden Robinson revealed that at one stage there were 2 different versions, specific versions that were put together, one that had absolutely every idea in, and one that completely pared that down. Now, I'm a huge fan of Sneakers, and so I was really curious about this, so I thought the best person to ask about that was Phil Alden Robinson. And here's what he told me.
This was an idea of Walter's. He said, as an exercise, let's put every good idea we've ever had into one long draft. And it must have been 170 pages. And we never showed that to anybody, but we put on the title page, Sneakers' Greatest Hits. And it was really fun. It had tons of cool stuff. And then he said, now, as an exercise, do the shortest possible version. and we called that Sneakers Light. And that was maybe 72 pages. It was tight as hell. But it showed us, okay, the tight is good. The story wants to move along at a good clip. But let's go through that big one and see which ones of these things we really want to put in there. And it helped us choose which pieces stayed and which pieces fell by the wayside. Most of the pieces that fell by the wayside fell easily because they didn't move the story along. They were just really cool things. As an example, after the bank sneak at the beginning, which is where, in that version, Bishop meets Liz. She works at the bank. And he says something about, the bozo who owns this bank. And she goes, well, that's my father. And he takes her to lunch. And he takes her to lunch to a Silicon Valley hangout that we've invented, where all these spies and people engaged in industrial espionage. And he narrates the place for her. He says, see, that guy over there, he's trying to find out the new Japanese technology that guy has. So when that guy leaves, watch, he's going to go pick up the tablecloth that the guy was writing notes on. And you get a sense of this world of people trying to steal each other's secrets. And Greg, the Russian guy, was in that scene. He comes over, Martin, I have 2 tickets to, Bolshoi Ballet for you. It was a great introduction to that world. And it helped us kind of couch that world in the terms that we wanted. But as a scene in a movie, the movie stops for that scene. So we thought, okay, let's take what we've learned from writing the scene and let that inform scenes where the plot is actually moving forward.
So with the script then, they fashioned a version of the script that they were happy with, but then there was the question of, well, who's going to direct the film? So Phil Alden Robinson at this point, he directed a couple of films. He'd done In the Mood in 1987, which I'd suggest kind of just has passed most people by, but a film that certainly hasn't passed most people by is 1989's Field of Dreams, starring Kevin Costner, that he made for Universal Pictures. And he had a development deal in place with Universal, and Field of Dreams was Oscar nominated, a huge success, and he's a much loved film. And because he had the development deal there, it seemed a logical place to try and set the movie up. But he's talked in several interviews over the years about how directing isn't really something he massively enjoys. He finds it very stressful, that as much as he enjoys the writing and the pre-production and he enjoys the post-production, the actual shoot he finds quite tiring. Now, he would say that Sneakers is pretty much as good as it got, that he enjoyed shooting Sneakers to a point, but nonetheless he saw it as a lot of decisions, a lot of pressures, and he was happier elsewhere in the process. Furthermore, when Parks and Lasker asked him about potentially directing Sneakers, he also had an alarm bell over the action stuff that had been written in. So why did he direct it in the end? Again, I'm not the best person to answer that, but I just happen to have the person who is. Back over to Phil Alden Robinson.
I got tricked into it. I always said, this is not, for me, there's people who do this kind of thing really well. And I'd never done, and I referred to it as the shiny stuff. I kept saying to Walter and Larry, there's people who do the shiny stuff really well. And there's action and there's things I hadn't done. I just thought, let's get, John Badham is a friend and he's a wonderful director, and they had worked with him on War Games, and John wasn't available. When it was time to try to figure out how to make the film, I had already set up an overall deal at Universal. And I said to Walter and Larry, hey, why don't we set this picture up under my deal? Universal will make it, and we'll get some director who does the shiny stuff, and we'll get actors. And Walter said, well, why don't you direct it? And I said, no. And one day he said to me, okay, look, I understand you're not going to direct the film, but I'm just curious, under what narrow set of circumstances would you direct it? He's a very smart guy, and I'm not. And so I answered the question. And I talked about, budget and cast and shoot in LA, not in Toronto. I gave him a whole list of things. And he went right to the studio and said, let's just tell him we'll do this, and he'll direct the film. And I realized I had politically stepped into it and there was no way out. And then part of me also was, I was flattered that they would think of me for this. And it was exciting. I loved this project. And there wasn't a scene in the movie that I wouldn't have been excited to shoot. I just didn't think I was the best guy to do it.
Turns out he probably was. With him now in as director, though, then it was the case of casting the film. And it's pretty well known that Robert Redford was kind of the domino that brought the rest of the cast together. But he takes on the role of Martin Bishop in the film. But at that stage, the role had been written for a 40-something, and Redford was in his 50s. Now, Redford at this stage had an agent, Mike Ovitz, a creative artists agency, legendary agency in the 80s and 90s for packaging movies, and Ovitz was pushing Redford to do more commercial fare. Now, Redford, according to biographies of him, his finances were a bit pushed at this stage, that he was funding the Sundance Institute. He was independently financing, in the first instance, his latest directorial effort, A River Runs Through It, which I'll come to shortly. But he was being pushed towards doing one or two more commercial films, as he would do throughout the 90s. So the script for Sneakers got to him, and Robinson found this out when he went to Kevin Costner's Oscar party in 1991. Now, this is where Costner won Best Picture and Best Director for Dances with Wolves, and he was at the party where he bumped into an agent who said, "Oh, Redford's into Sneakers." And so Robinson was just like, well, how can that be? He doesn't fit the role. And it turns out by that stage, Redford was reading the script and was really interested in taking the part on. And so Robinson went home that night. He's told this story a couple of times and read the script again, but he imagined the character of Martin as Redford, and he just felt it was the best version of it. And for a man who'd spent years writing and researching this film, he was very suddenly sold on this particular bit of casting. And the story goes that Redford would score a payday in the region of $7-8 million for the movie, which was I think it was one of his biggest, if not his biggest, at that point. And so the deal was ultimately done between Mike Ovitz and the then head of Universal, Tom Pollock. And the day after that Oscar party, Robinson put a call into Tom Pollock, who was in a meeting with the very top studio brass. He asked to get a message to him urgently. He came out, just said Redford, Sneakers. Pollock was just like, all right. And so the deal was ultimately done. Robinson went to meet Redford for a meeting, and they swapped stories, and they got on really well. And as part of Redford's deal at Universal, the deal would be that he would direct A River Runs Through It, and then he would pause the post-production on that movie and do it once he'd finished shooting Sneakers. As it would turn out, Universal would pay for an edit suite for Redford to be by the soundstage where Sneakers was shooting, so when Redford wasn't needed on the set of Sneakers, he could just pop next door and edit his upcoming movie. Bringing the rest of the cast together, certainly once Redford was in place, wasn't as tricky, therefore, but also it helped that the people really liked the script. So an offer went out to Sir Ben Kingsley to play the role of Cosmo, for instance, and Kingsley just again, he really liked it. He met Phil Alden Robinson in New York, and he figured that the character of Cosmo needed to be played quite deadpan, and he saw Cosmo as a man who just didn't have emotional circuitry unless his old friend was with him, and just the key combination at the heart of the movie is the friendship between Cosmo and Martin. Now, an offer with that offer out, Phil Alden Robinson also knew Dan Aykroyd. He had a way into him, and so he just asked Aykroyd. At this point, he was known almost exclusively for his comedy role, so he wasn't taking on much in the way of dramatic support, but asked him if he was interested in the character of Mother. Aykroyd said, really like the script, I want to play Cosmo, and Robinson just explained, we're out, we've got an offer out to someone to play Cosmo at the moment. It's just said, well, I can play it really well. Who have you got the offer out to? I said, well, Sir Ben Kingsley. Well, Ben Kingsley, to which Aykroyd said, yeah, I'd love to play Mother, and that's how that happened. Sidney Poitier, again, Robinson had a slight in with him, got him the script. Poitier rang him up the day after he got the script. He said it's one of the most entertaining things he's ever written, and he was very much in and happy to be part of the ensemble. Mary McDonnell came into the project off the back of her Oscar-nominated work in Dances with Wolves, which had hugely impressed Phil Alden Robinson. Then David Strathairn, who plays Whistler, Whistler's a blind man in the film, and he came along to a casting session in New York, and Strathairn's approach to that, which is what swung him the role, was to play the character of Whistler with his ears rather than his eyes. He made sure that his character was very much a listener, and that contrasted with the other people who are coming through the door at that point. Stephen Tobolowsky, who at this point wasn't Ned Ryerson in Groundhog Day, but soon would be. I mean, he's just astonishing as in the character of Werner in this one. He had to be persuaded to audition for it. He had to be persuaded to read the script because he was put off by the title at first, read the script when he was nudged to do so, and couldn't sign up quickly enough. In fact, he would go on to tell Slate in a series of articles that Slate did celebrating the film that it was the most fun he'd ever had on a movie. Then, with primarily an older cast in place, Universal just said to Robinson, we need to have someone younger. And the studio provided a list of just who those candidates for a younger role, the character of Carl in the film, could be. Now, River Phoenix was on that list, and he'd auditioned for Phil Alden Robinson before and didn't get the job, just primarily because the humour was lacking at that point, and Phoenix was too serious in his audition. But they both remembered and talked about it. Now, Phoenix was based in Florida and he came over to LA to meet, and he was quickly signed up for the film. And in fact, Robinson told me a story of how of ringing Phoenix up and telling him Sidney Poitier is now being cast in it, and Phoenix being hugely excited by that. With the ensemble all in place, it was pretty much ready to shoot. That there was some rehearsal time, but with a budget in the region of $25 million, the film could shoot in California, in San Francisco and LA in October of 1991. That's when it started. Now, Redford did, as promised, come to the film just after finishing shooting on A River Runs Through It. And then, but going back to one of the reasons that Phil Alden Robinson didn't want to direct the film in the first place, there was the action sequences in the movie. Now, a little bit daunted at the thought of filming these, Robinson got in touch with his old friend John Badham about, well, how do you shoot it? Because you've got guards running around, you've got gunshots. There's not huge amounts of action. There's a van driving sequence in there, but how do you shoot them? And it was Badham who just said it's the setting unit that does that. You tell them what you want. You sit in the chair, you watch them do it. It's fairly straightforward. Now, the action that Robinson did direct himself in the film, well, it's also, and again, I'm going to spoil a lot as possible for those of you who've not had the pleasure of this film, it's really slow. It has the world's slowest action sequences in the film, which notches the tension right through the roof. But at one stage, particularly towards the end of the film, it wasn't always so. That whilst the action was scripted slowly on the page, there was some, what Robinson told me was some rollicking action sequences. And I asked him a bit about just what one of those sequences could have been. Thankfully, he told me.
There was a scene when the sneakers are in the building, they're on the top floor, and they want to get to the basement, because that's going to be their way out. And they're running through the hallways and people are running after them. And Bishop sees a chute in the wall. It's a trash chute. It's a classified trash chute. And he says, here, go down here. And they all dive into this trash chute and they come tumbling down this several stories to where a shredder, the teeth of a shredder are shredding the trash. And Mother has to jam something to stop that. And then the sprays start and they go, oh my God, it's acid wash. We're just making stuff up. And they have to stop the acid wash. I mean, it was fun. Then we actually were going to shoot it. Then we had got that budgeted, what it was going to cost to build that 3-story shredder chute. And we said, you know what, maybe we'll just have them run out of the building.
Which again is exactly what happened. Now there were, other little stories from in and around the shoot. I mean, Mary McDonnell and Stephen Tobolowsky, they have wonderful sequences in the film, and they did work on these. They worked on improvisation in rehearsal, and Tobolowsky in particular was given pretty free rein to say what he wants and does in the film, and it's incredibly joyful. There's also a moment in the movie where a huge audio clue is played over and over and over and over again while we're watching what's going on. And I did ask Phil Alden Robinson about this and about whether a sequence like that was ever in doubt. And he was just adamant from the off. They knew what was right there. They knew that they got it because they'd written a sequence and they filmed a sequence where all the characters are focused on one thing on screen and they're just not listening to what's actually playing in the background. It's not even in the background thinking about it. And so little bits like that just didn't change because they'd worked the script for so long and they were really, really happy with it. Now, David Strathairn, again, he would go onto the sets, the sound stages that they were shooting on. And for instance, he had a tuning fork with him, but he brought little things around the set that he could play with. Again, he was just playing heavily with sound where he could. He also, when they weren't shooting, would walk around the sets with his eyes closed so that he could learn them. Apart from, there's an exception to this, where at one point they go to an apartment in the film that his character wouldn't have visited before, and that's the only one he didn't walk around in advance, so that it could just be a little bit more natural that he just wasn't familiar with the surroundings there. There are a couple of really ambitious shots as well. As much as Phil Alden Robinson says he's not a huge fan of directing, he really does go for it in certain places. So there's a moment early in the film with what we see as the NSA office, and two NSA guys come in to meet Robert Redford's Martin Bishop, and you have to watch it quite closely because it's a really long shot and it's not immediately apparent just because it's not that fussy. And here a couple of influences Robinson had. First was Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, but also he was thinking with this of the Eagles song Hotel California, and trying to go with the rhythm of the guitar solos in that they start freeform and then they come together by the end. And that's how they approach filming this extensive 3-page sequence of dialogue, which is done pretty much in one continuous shot, but the camera is always moving throughout it. I should note as well, there is a cameo towards the end of the film, which I really don't want to spoil if you've not seen it. It was someone that Phil Alden Robinson had worked with before, and there's a few people in the cast Timothy Busfield, come across from Field of Dreams, for instance. There's a few people like that, and it was a case of Robinson put in a call, and this actor agreed to come and do a day's work on it to shoot this particular sequence. And with that in the can, the principal photography of Sneakers was completed in January 1992, and it was heading towards release. The release was earmarked for September of that year, and so there was just post-production to get through. Now, a couple of things in post-production. James Horner the late great composer James Horner had done the Field of Dreams score for Phil Alden Robinson, and he'd worked on a project that the other producers, but the other writers, Parks and Lasker, had produced, called Project X, and he'd done the score for that. And so Robinson had put a temp score to the movie that used bits of Philip Glass, John Adams, Steve Wright. What he saw were metronomic composers. Horner really loved that and based his score around that, but also zeroed in on the characters for the musical cues that he was going for. I think the score to Sneakers is exceptional. I mean, it's a film with no shortage of influences. I mean, 3 Days of the Condor is regularly cited, but also just the little tickles in the score as well are just worth listening out for. Now, the film was edited by the late Tom Rolfe, who will go on to do Heat, actually, not too long afterwards. And Robinson's argument in post-production is every day, once you've seen the first original assembly, the film just gets better. But this was editing on film, and this built-in thinking time for Robinson, that he would ask for a shot, Tom Rolfe would go off and get it, and at that point you had to hang up the film, and that would take 5-10 minutes just to get it all loaded. And he would use that time just to look at other shots in what they had and just think about what they wanted and gradually put all this together. There were lots of cuts done of the film, and in fact Robinson told me that he made video cassettes of each of his cuts, but to his regret he never saved them. However, there's a lot of deleted material. There's an extended party scene, for instance, but the footage of that remains in a vault at Universal with no sign really of coming out. I asked him if he'd ever considered doing any kind of director's or extended cut, but he's pretty adamant about this is the length that the film needed to be, and he was always very comfortable with that. That said, there was a fairly significant change in post-production on Sneakers, that the first time he showed it to the studio, the ending was different. It was an ending that, I think I can say this as this didn't happen, where the Sneakers get the chip back that they're looking for, and then you cut to the next morning at San Francisco Harbor. They walk to the end of the pier there, they throw the chip into the water. There was a slow motion shot done of it hitting the water, going underwater. The sneakers turn around, walk into the sunrise, start putting their arms around each other. A little bit of friction between Robert Redford and Mary McDonald's character. But as Robinson said, when he showed it to the studio, they were really into the film, but the ending fell flat. And he felt for the first time that the ending was boring. And they needed to come up with something very, very quickly, really. And so he sat with Tom Rolfe and they started coming up with ideas of what people could use the chip for. And I find this really eye-opening, that a film that had taken a decade to write, and they'd researched it just to get that script right, the ending came together incredibly quickly, and they came up with a new ending that I mean, Robinson had to ring the head of Universal up and say, look, I need to reshoot it. And, you know, rolled eyes, how much is this going to cost? And actually the cost of the extra footage they needed for the ending was $21, because he rang a college TV station that he used to work with, well, he'd done some work with before, to come up with to insert really a newsreader doing a joke about Republicans and funds for Republicans. And that was shot at the end of that college TV station's day, and the $21 was the cost of FedExing the footage across. When it was put in front of a test screening, it got a huge laugh. Now, Robinson told me again that he, as much as he does test screenings, he's not really interested in what the audience wants changed about the film. He just wants to know that they understand it, and that's what he kept tuning. Universal, meanwhile, it knew it had something on its hands, and it was quite innovative the way that it promoted the film, in that this was one of the very, very, very first, it might even be the first film, Hollywood film certainly, to have a digital press kit. That journalists were given a floppy disk, and if you go onto the Internet Archive, archive.org, you can find this press kit there, where all the press materials were digital. And now analog versions on pieces of paper were provided as well. But the fact that the press kit was provided in this form, well, that became a story in itself. The film, when it was put in front of critics, rightly got good reviews, warm reviews as well. Not outright raves, but over time, its reputation has certainly built and built and built and built. And also, this was a box office hit, that it opened in September of 1992 in the US, and it opened with a 10 million opening weekend. In second place was Honeymoon in Vegas, really underrated Nicolas Cage, Sarah Jessica Parker film, that. The other big openers, well, big-ish openers that week were Hellraiser 3, that was out, Wind, that was out, lots of wind around then, but Sneakers was number one with a 10 million gross, and Universal was happy with that, not least when the film went on to do 51 million in the US, another 53 million overseas. Now, in the aftermath of it, I mean, it would be a good video hit as well. Redford would go on to drop a couple of big commercial projects that he was attached to, Crisis in the Hot Zone and The American President, but he would go on to do things like Indecent Proposal, that would be far more mainstream, and he would complete A River Runs Through It as well. But Phil Alden Robinson, well, it took him a long time to direct again. It would be the Tom Clancy adaptation, the Jack Ryan film, The Sum of All Fears, which I'll come to in the future. But there was talk for a while in 2016 of a Sneakers TV series that Walter F. Parks, was involved with. And Universal did approach Robinson about whether he'd be interested in getting involved, and he said he was asked to direct the pilot, and he asked to see the script, but his feeling was that he doesn't really like making sequels, that all a sequel would be is more plot, and it was actually the characters that really interested him. As it stands then, Sneakers is a one-off. It stands alone. And as Robinson told me, he just said, we want to make one of those for us. That was the aim that he and the co-writers went in with. And that's what they got. And I think that the fact that nearly 30 years on, the film is still considered so highly is down to just that ethos that they put into it. I really think it's a smashing film. Now, I should just plug something that I'm doing with regards to Sneakers as well, because you heard a couple of interview excerpts in there. I'm in the midst of putting together, in conjunction with Plumeria Pictures, the very first Film Stories Blu-ray release here in the UK, and it is of Sneakers. And I did an hour and a quarter chatting to Phil Alden Robinson about the film, and a good chunk of that is going to be on the new Blu-ray, as well as one or two other extras. And you can find more on that at store.filmstories.co.uk. Also, if I can do one more plug, as we appear to have happened at the halfway point of the podcast, if you do like this podcast, I am still an independent. It's still just me in a room without a big company behind me. And so I've got here because of your support. If you can ideally leave me a hugely positive review and subscribe to this podcast, that would help enormously. I have a new issue of Film Stories magazine out as well, and you can find that at the same place you can find the Sneakers Blu-ray, store.filmstories.co.uk. And the Sneakers Blu-ray is out the 28th of June 2021 as things stand. And yeah, if you can support that, that would be amazing. But I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this podcast. I'm just moving forward a few years. I'll play you a clip. We'll come to it. Come to the story the other side of this.
Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life.
And that then is a clip from 1996's William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, depending where you live in the world, Romeo plus Juliet in other places. Directed by Baz Luhrmann, screenplay by Luhrmann and Craig Pearce. I have to mention the editing is by Jill Bilcock as well. I mean, astonishing editing work on this one. The cast: Leonardo DiCaprio, Claire Danes, Brian Dennehy, John Leguizamo, Pete Postlethwaite, Paul Sorvino, and the wonderful Miriam Margolyes is in the ensemble, an extensive ensemble for the film as well. Now, this was another film that took a lot of research before it came together, although it didn't take quite as long as Sneakers. But it started with Baz Luhrmann, and he broke into the movie world with 1992's charming Australian hit Strictly Ballroom. And off the back of Strictly Ballroom's success, it was almost assumed inevitable that Baz Luhrmann would go to Hollywood, and he did. But not for a while, because in the aftermath of Strictly Ballroom going around the world, well, he did a lot of work in Australia at first. He worked on operas. He worked for the Australian Labour Party, doing one or two videos for them for a while. But all the while, he was noodling with the idea of a big screen Shakespeare adaptation. And let me tell you, this was not an idea that was considered box office gold. But the core of it, and he said this in loads of interviews promoting the film, is if Shakespeare was making a movie of one of his plays today, well, in the mid-1990s, but, you know, semantics, how would he go about doing that? And so he settled on a modern telling of Romeo and Juliet. However, it would be fair to say his door was not being knocked down, because at this stage, I mean, contextually, a Hollywood studio hadn't paid up for a named Shakespeare adaptation in an awful long time, if at all. Luhrmann argued at the time that the most recent film to successfully adapt Shakespeare for the big screen had been Kenneth Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing, which came out in 1993, and whilst that was considered a hit, it did, 15-20 million of business worldwide. And so this wasn't viewed as any kind of big mainstream project. But here's where that commercial success of Strictly Ballroom paid off, because the film had made around $70-80 million around the world on a very modest budget, and that in turn had earned Baz Luhrmann a first look deal with 20th Century Fox in the US. But Fox wasn't really interested in him doing Romeo and Juliet. However, he convinced the studio to let him have a few $1,000s just to try and put something together, to kind of a proof of concept to see if it will work. Now, Luhrmann had one person in mind for Romeo, and he's often said, it's just like, interview directors sometimes, it's just like, there's only one person I was thinking of. But this is the consistent message that comes across in all of the conversations on Romeo and Juliet. He wanted Leonardo DiCaprio. Now, DiCaprio was in the infancy of his career at this point. He'd broken through with What's Eating Gilbert Grape, and an astonishing performance in This Boy's Life from director Michael Caton Jones as well. But it wasn't box office gold either at this point. And so he gave DiCaprio a call, and DiCaprio was interested. Now, Lerman had a plan at that point to put on a workshop in Australia and just get some shots in. And he asked if he wanted to come along. DiCaprio said he was, and paid his own airfare to get from the US to Australia for the workshop. Now, Lerman had seen something of James Dean in DiCaprio, which is why he wanted him for Romeo. And a workshop took place with some Australian actors as well. And that led to Lerman going off and doing work on the script that he would then start to put together with his collaborator on this one, Craig Pearce, and the screenplay would start to come together. However, there was still quite a way to go, because as Lerman explained in an interview, he said, we created a world. It's American, Latin. It looks a bit like South America. It feels a bit like Mexico. It feels somewhat like Miami, but ultimately it's Verona Beach, which he describes as a universal city. And Lerman argued that choosing to set the film there was not out of keeping with what Shakespeare did. He never went to Verona. He said he created his mythical city. And so really it was London dressed up as quote a hot version of London. And that was part of the process for Lerman, just in terms of writing the location where he wanted this taking place. He said, we spent a lot of time researching the Elizabethan stage and transformed that into cinematic ideas. There was a huge amount of preparation to get to this point, and how Shakespeare was staging his stuff when he originally wrote his plays, with the idea of going back to that mantra, how would he make a movie? With the script in place, he then held another workshop. DiCaprio came down from America again for that one. More local Australian actors came in. They workshopped a scene in Sydney with the characters of Romeo and Tybalt, and it's a big fight scene, getting out the cars. And this was the scene that was then sent to 20th Century Fox to see if it was interested in stumping up the $10-15 million it was going to cost to make the film. And as soon as Fox saw that it was a film basically about gang warfare, it got it, and it was in. And because the budget was quite low in the scheme of things, it just wasn't the biggest risk either. Certainly not the biggest risk on its slate. It was considering making a film called Titanic, and that was going to cost a bit more. And also, here was the guy who made Strictly Ballroom. You know, he made a film that had been done on a low budget that looked more expensive and gone on to make lots of money, and they got to take a chance on him, they figured. And so Baz Luhrmann had his green light. As it turned out, that was just the start of the problems. Now, John Leguizamo's memoir, I'm going to quote from, and again, it's called Pimps, Hoes, Players, Haters, and All the Rest of My Hollywood Friends. So if I'm quoting Leguizamo just over the next few minutes, it's coming from that. Because he talks about auditioning for the role of Tybalt in the movie, and he said the competition for that was down to him, Benicio del Toro, and somebody else who he didn't name. Along with the likes of Ewan McGregor and Christian Bale, he'd actually had his eye on the role of Mercutio, because he kind of figured he has the best speeches, but Lerman had decided he wanted the character of Mercutio to be black, but he wanted the character of Tybalt to be Hispanic, and so Leguizamo put his name he went and auditioned for that, and he did 4 hours of auditioning for him before Lerman decided, he's the one that I want. Now, as for Juliet, this was a role that proved much harder to cast. Now, whilst DiCaprio was always Romeo, I mean, Sarah Michelle Gellar at one point, her name was linked with playing Juliet, but she also had other filming commitments that knocked her out. It's pretty well known that Natalie Portman flew to Australia with a view of taking the role on, but at this stage, she was looking too young for the role, and so they shot footage of Portman and DiCaprio in one of the kissing scenes, and it just looked off, and it looked tonally off, and Baz Luhrmann decided that wasn't really the way that he wanted to go, and so Portman didn't get that role. In the end, it was a conversation with another Australian director that Luhrmann had, Jane Campion, Oscar nominated for The Piano, that led to Claire Danes. That Campion recommended that Luhrmann watch the TV show My So-Called Life on US TV that Danes was starring in at the time, and he did. He went back to America and met her, and she came in for an audition, and what really impressed them about Claire Danes was she just went toe-to-toe with DiCaprio, that whereas some auditionees had come in and were said to be a little bit in awe of him, she just walked her right up, and this is Luhrmann, quoted from the book Baz Luhrmann Interviews by Tom Ryan. She walked right up to him and said, "Art thou not Romeo and a Montague?" and kissed him, and just said they were strong. It is crucial because the film is so frenetic, said Luhrmann, that when they get together, you need time to stand still. I don't expect everyone to get it, but I think they do achieve that. I think they do bring a stillness to a film. In terms of other casting for the movie, there was a young Paul Rudd. He scored a role in the film. I think he was 25, 26 at the point that he landed his name on the call sheet. Marlon Brando was linked with the role of Father Lawrence at one point as well, but he was unable to take the role on. The explanation was family reasons. Pete Postlethwaite came in and took that part on as well. And the rest of the ensemble came together, but also the plan with this was to shoot in Mexico. And John Leguizamo explains about just some of the pre-production work on that. And he says, I'll give you an example of how surreal it all was. He says, we're up in a chopper flying over the desert looking for Mantua, and we see tiny little sheds. So we fly down, we land, and the wind from the chopper blades blows everything all over. The sheds the villagers were living in were cardboard boxes. And he says, our Mexican interpreter says, look, we want to make a film and we're going to build some good things here, but we'll leave everything for you and we're going to pay you this money. And he said, they're over the moon. We came back, we built the entire town of Mantua there. Everything you see there, all of those shacks, the cars, everything, all the people were employed, and they left it all behind in a better state, and it doesn't happen very often with films, than they actually found it. There were a couple of weeks of rehearsals in Manhattan, which I think took place either in December 1995 or very early January 1996, before filming began in January of 1996, with shooting primarily taking place in Mexico, but also a bit of it taking place in California as well. But it would be a very, very difficult shoot. Now, it didn't help that at first Romeo and Juliet didn't massively get on. I think it's a very cliched thing that it was reported that Claire Danes was accused of being uptight and DiCaprio was accused of being immature, and neither of them really gone on record with exactly what the problem was. But there does seem to be a consensus that it took a little while for them to actually grow to like each other. In the midst of production, and Leguizamo just gives a flavour of the kind of camaraderie and what kind of set it was, because he talks in his memoir about he got a phone call from his other half midway through production telling him basically that she was finishing with him. And he says Leo DiCaprio saw it and decided he had to cheer me up. He was really good about it, even if the way he went about it was really bad. And Leguizamo describes that, I mean, it's primarily a young cast, and he says, oh man, we went crazy, mad crazy. Those are all of his crazies. He said it was the wildest party, strippers, hookers, getting into fights in clubs. I thought Casualties of War, that Leguizamo had made with Brian De Palma, was a crazy shoot, but this was crazier. And because the majority of the cast was younger than I was, I felt challenged to act even crazier than they were. A lot of stupid male nonsense. And he does talk about some people should be very pleased that things weren't videoed, although he doesn't name names or imply anyone in particular. And I add that just in case any lawyers are listening. Back onto the shoot itself as well, there was a fairly hairy moment when a group of local bandits kidnapped Aldo Signoretti, who was the makeup man on the film. And I mean, he'd worked with the likes of Fellini, and they sent Baz Luhrmann a ransom note demanding $300 for his return, and Luhrmann just agreed to pay it. And so they handed over the $300, and they gave Signoretti back with a broken leg. Brian Dennehy, Leguizamo describes him as exactly the kind of tough cookie you'd expect. I mean, we lost him fairly recently, and he says, I think he was drying out at the time, so that made him a little edgy. And there was a little bit of temper to him, from what I understand. Whereas Miriam Margolyes was, well, if you see Miriam Margolyes, you got Miriam Margolyes, and apparently she was a whole host of fun on the film. Leguizamo also said that he ad-libbed a little bit, which isn't something you're supposed to do with Shakespeare, but he did try one or two lines, and one or two actually made it into the film. He would also argue that all the young American actors had problems with their speeches, and he says you could definitely see it in the movie. The British ones, of course, rocked it because they're the only ones who can do Shakespeare correctly. They're schooled in it and they grow up with it. I'm British, I can't do Shakespeare correctly. Luhrmann was pushing the actors to be as extreme as possible with the performances. Some of them pushed back a little bit, but this was going to be a very heightened Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it would be described in the aftermath as the MTV version of it. And so Luhrmann knew what he wanted. He knew the style that he wanted, and he was pushing his ensemble to give him that. But also what around that, I mean, nature was coming into play as well. I mean, a hurricane was blowing into the area where they were filming at one stage, and the town of Veracruz was boarded up, and everyone went indoors. And at that point, Luhrmann went to the beach to shoot the scene that you see in the movie with hurricane clouds in the background coming towards them. That was not a special effect, that the wind really was blowing the sand that much. The clouds were real, and basically as soon as they got the shot that they need, they retreated. The hurricane came into that beach and the set was completely blown away. Luhrmann also, shooting was shot down for a week when Luhrmann was ill. His temperature soared, and there was a sense that it was a taxing shoot, and there was a sense that it was always on the verge of falling behind schedule, though it did ultimately make it into the can in April of 1996. He wouldn't regret shooting in Mexico, though. He's as much as it had been an incredibly challenging place to shoot the movie, he was really pleased with the footage that he got and the style of the film that he got. And as filming wrapped up, Paul Rudd and Leonardo DiCaprio had a conversation, because DiCaprio had been offered a starring role in a film called Titanic that was going to shoot soon. And as the story goes, Rudd advised, yeah, it's probably worth going for that. Now, heading into post-production, in the prologue, or the prologue to the play and the prologue to the film, it talks about the fact that it's 2 hours you're going to get the story. And so that's what Baz Luhrmann wanted to do. He wanted this to have a 2-hour running time to make good on the promise of the prologue he'd put on film. He moved pre-production on the movie had taken place primarily in Australia, and then away from Fox as well. And when it came to post-production, he did the same thing. This was not a Hollywood movie in the traditional sense. It was put together in post in the US. The music by Nelly Hopper, Marius de Vries and Craig Armstrong, you heard a bit of the Armstrong score there, was put together at that point as well. But Luhrmann said the edit really needed to zip. That he said, I wanted to zip through the city and through any boring bits in the story. He was hugely influenced by the rapidly changing styles he saw in Hindi movies as well. They changed genre pretty much on you, the films that he was citing, just with a click of your fingers. And that's what he wanted to get. So he got his film together, and it premiered in October 1996 in the US before getting a wide release in November of that year. And you tackle Shakespeare in a modern way and you mess with the language, you are going to get backlash. And Baz Luhrmann certainly got backlash. Now, some people really didn't take the idea of a kind of punky version of Romeo and Juliet. Roger Ebert, for instance, was one of those who didn't. But there was quite a lot of positive press for it. And also it really captured a younger market as well, which Fox, for one, hadn't been expecting. Because to its surprise and delight, this film really opened well. Its opening weekend in the US was $11.1 million. And it knocked a far more expensive movie, Sleepers, off the top of the box office. Sleepers had a huge ensemble to it, and it cost about 60-70 million to make. But that knocked into second place, Romeo and Juliet into first. The other opener the other opener of note that week was a film called Larger Than Life, which involved a huge elephant and Bill Murray. And I don't think there was a massive crossover with Shakespeare there. But what was particularly impressive with Romeo and Juliet is the box office kept rolling in. And it would go on and make 46 million in the US, but also this had a real international flavour as well. Another 100 million came in from around the world. And the return on this $15 million film in the end was 147 million. And Baz Luhrmann had comfortably won his gamble on this one. Furthermore, 2 soundtrack albums came out of it as well, and particularly the first one was a huge seller and continues to be a huge seller. And what's been notable about Romeo plus Juliet, as we'll call it just for this one, is how well the tale of it, that it's continued to be used. Inevitably a good Shakespeare adaptation turns up in schools and academia, but it's become comfortably one of the more popular of the last 20-30 years. At the time of this recording, it's turned up on Disney Plus as well in its star section, along with all the mucky stuff. Amongst the people who were really impressed with the film was Kenneth Branagh, because he'd done Much Ado About Nothing and he was trying to do a big budget version of Hamlet. That was what he was going off to do, and he sent a hugely congratulatory card to Baz Luhrmann, not least for the film, but also for opening Shakespeare up to a wider audience. And Fox, well, it wasn't going to mess around where Baz Luhrmann was concerned. It signed him up for 2 more films. The next one would be a movie called Moulin Rouge, which I'll come to another time, that will complete what became known as the Red Curtain trilogy. But for the purposes of this story, Luhrmann had gone into this wanting to do a Shakespeare film as Shakespeare would have made it. What he also got was quite a sizable box office hit off the back of it. Which all brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you so much, as always, for putting up with me. And just to give another plug to that Sneakers Blu-ray, which we are working our backsides off on, that you can find us more on store.filmstories.co.uk. I should know that by now. You can get more of my waffling, if you can tolerate it, on Twitter at Simon Brew. The entire Film Stories project is at Film Stories Pod. Our website, filmstories.co.uk, is updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, more film stories, basically, all sorts of mayhem there. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories. And if you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can get issue 25 of our magazine, which is shipping now, which leads on a huge interview with Ben Wheatley about In the Earth, about the Tomb Raider film he's never got to make, and also his impending project, The Meg 2. But with all those plugs done, I'm going to call this one a day because I've gone on far too long as usual. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye-bye.
Be a beacon.